In today's video, we're covering another US highway, this being US 90. US 90 is 1,633 miles going through Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. US 90 begins in Van Horn at I-10, and we're now signed for Van Horn Drive, which this should be Marfa, not Van Horn Drive. On the mileage sign, Valentine is our secondary in 38 miles, and Marfa is now our primary in 74. In Marfa, we meet US 67 and are now concurrent with it, signed for Alpine. I honestly have no clue why this mileage sign is an extra line, but anyways, Alpine is now the secondary in 25 miles, and Marathon is our primary in 55. I'd say just to keep this mileage sign a one-liner, honestly. When US 67 leaves us past Alpine, it's signed north for Fort Stockton, and we're now signed east for Marathon. Reason being because of the US 385 interchange, but it basically serves no purpose going north to also Fort Stockton and south to like nowhere basically, so I'd sign Del Rio here. In Marathon, we meet US 385 and are now concurrent with it, signed for Fort Stockton and Sanderson. Fort Stockton is for US 385 and Sanderson is for US 90, and also just signed Del Rio. Sanderson is signed because of US 285, which also goes to Fort Stockton. Like, it doesn't make sense. When US 385 leaves us, we have the same control cities. Once again, this should just be Del Rio. On the mileage sign, the only city on it is Sanderson at 52 miles. Just sign Del Rio. In Sanderson, we meet US 285 and are now signed for Dryden, which is even worse. It's an unincorporated community. Just sign Del Rio already. In Dryden, we meet Texas 349 and are now signed for Langtree, which is also unincorporated. Please just sign Del Rio already. On the mileage sign, this is fixed, with Del Rio now being on the bottom line at 101 miles, and Langtree is now our secondary in 41. In Langtree, we get a mileage sign with Comstock as our new secondary in 28 miles, and Del Rio is now only 60 miles away. Outside of Del Rio, we meet US 277 and 377 and are now concurrent with them, signed for Del Rio. When we turn left here, US 377 just randomly ends, which is shoulda when it met US 277 a while ago. But anyways, we're now signed for Laughlin Air Force Base, Bracketville, and Eagle Pass. Laughlin Air Force Base and Bracketville for US 90, and Eagle Pass for US 277. Also, just sign Uvalde instead of Bracketville. When US 277 leaves us, it is signed south for Eagle Pass and Laredo. At that same interchange, we're now signed east for San Antonio, which is what should be signed. However, in Bracketville, when we meet Texas 131, we're now signed east for Uvalde and 40 miles. If you sign San Antonio, keep the San Antonio signage up. On the mileage sign, Uvalde is our secondary in 40 miles and Hondo is our primary in 84, which is part of the San Antonio metropolitan area. If you're doing this, just sign San Antonio. In Uvalde, we meet US 83 and are signed east for Hondo. Once again, just sign San Antonio already, please. When we meet Texas 173, we're finally signed east for San Antonio again. On the mileage side, San Antonio is now only 34 miles away. When we meet I-410, which serves as the inner beltway to San Antonio, we're still signed east for San Antonio. Here we get a sign for the exit with Texas Loop 13, also Military Drive, signed for JBSA Lackland. This exit was requested by the Times Are Here. When we meet I-10 and I-35, we're now running concurrently with I-10 along with US 87, signed for Houston. When we meet I-37, we have the same control cities, but US 87 gains its control city of Victoria. When US 87 leaves us, it is still signed for Victoria and is also signed for Roland Avenue, and we're still signed for Houston with I-10. When we meet I-410 on the other side of the city, we're still signed for Houston. When we meet I-610, like I-410 serves as an inner beltway to Houston, and US 90 is now unsigned, and we're now signed east for downtown Houston. When we meet I-45, we're now signed east for Beaumont, and US 90 is still unsigned. Likewise, when we meet I-69, we're still signed east for Beaumont, and US 90 is still unsigned. When we meet I-610 on the other side of Houston, US 90 actually leaves I-10 at the same time, still signed east for Beaumont, and we're now signed east for Liberty. At this exit, we meet FM 2100 and 1942, signed for Crosby. This exit was requested by the Times Are Here. In Dayton, we meet Texas 146 and are now concurrent with it and are now signed for Beaumont, which is a good choice. But when we meet Texas 321, it's back to Liberty. What was the point of signing Beaumont then? Just keep this as Beaumont if you're gonna sign it. When Texas 146 leaves us, we're now signed east for Beaumont again. In Beaumont, we meet I-10 again, but it also has US 69, 96, and 287 along with it, and we're now concurrent with all these highways. When US 69, 96, and 287 leave us, we're now signed east for Lake Charles, which this should be Baton Rouge instead, not Lake Charles. We're now crossing over the Sabine River into Louisiana. When we leave I-10, we're now signed for 2 Louisiana 109, Toomey, and Starks. This sign is horrible, just sign Vinton. When we meet Louisiana 109, we're clearly signed east for Vinton. When we meet some random road east of Vinton, we're now signed east for Sulphur. When we meet Louisiana 27 in Sulphur, we're now signed east for Westlake. Just sign Lake Charles. US 90 is the fastest way to get there from here. West of Westlake, we meet I-10 again, and we're now running concurrent with it again. When we leave I-10, we're now signed east for 2 Louisiana 14. When we meet US 171, signed north for DeRidder, and Louisiana 14, signed south for Cameron, we're now signed east for Lafayette due to the upcoming interchange with I-210. When we meet I-210, it is signed for 2 I-10 east to Lafayette. When we meet Louisiana 397, we're now signed east for Iowa, the city, not the state. On the mileage sign east of Iowa, Welsh is our secondary in 10 miles, and Lafayette is on the bottom line in 62. But in Lacassine, our primary is now Jennings in 16. Honestly, either pick Lafayette or actually sign Welsh before Jennings, honestly. In Jennings, we meet Louisiana 102 and are now signed east for Mermentau. I'd sign Crowley here, honestly. Past Mermentau, our new control city is Crowley in 12 miles. In Crowley, we meet Louisiana 13 and we are now signed east for Rain. In Rain, we meet Louisiana 35 and we're now signed east for Lafayette. But going up to I-10 is the faster way to Lafayette from here, and so is Scott. So I'd say signing Deuce in here is probably the right choice, honestly. When we meet Louisiana 343, we're now signed east for Lafayette, and now I'd actually sign Scott since US 90 still isn't the fastest way to Lafayette yet. In Lafayette, we're now signed east for New Iberia, and also we're now on future I-49. So when and if this becomes I-49, this should be Homa, but New Iberia is fine for now. In New Iberia, we meet Louisiana 14 again, and we're now signed east for Morgan City, which is fine now, but sign Homa when and if this becomes I-49. In Morgan City, we're now signed east for New Orleans, actually, which is honestly better than signing Homa, so I have nothing against it, but when and if this becomes I-49, keep Homa for the consistency. At exit 194, we meet Louisiana 20 for Chacahula and Thibodaux. This exit was requested by Matt Weebler. At exit 200, we meet Louisiana 311, which is signed for nothing. It probably should be signed for Homa, but anyways, this exit was requested by At Workstation because this is the exit they take to go home coming from the west. 2 miles later, we meet Louisiana 24, signed for Thibodaux and Huma. This exit was also requested by Matt Weebler. At exit 215, we meet Louisiana 1, signed for Raceland and Lockport. This exit was also requested by Matt Weebler. At the end of I-310, US 90 is now signed east for Boutte in New Orleans. When we meet unsigned I-910, we're now signed for the Superdome and Claiborne Avenue. Here we meet I-610, signed east for Slidell. This should be Gulfport to Biloxi, not Slidell. When we meet I-10 again, we're now signed east for the Chef Mentor Highway. When we meet I-510, we're still signed east for the Chef Mentor Highway. When we meet US 11, it is signed north for Irish Bayou, and we're now signed east for Venetian Isles and Bay St. Louis. I'd sign Burlington here, although US 90 has some road closures at the border with Mississippi, so US 90 isn't the fastest way to Burlington currently. Also, Dirtbog requested this interchange because of his videos on US 11, which you should check out after this video, linked in the description. We're now crossing over the Pearl River into Mississippi. I don't really like how they made the S's on the state welcome sign, not gonna lie. Right before crossing into Bay St. Louis's city limits, we get a mileage sign with it on the third line in a mile, Gulfport in 17, and Biloxi in 25. In Gulfport, we meet US 49, and we're now signed east for Biloxi. At the end of I-110, we're now signed east for Ocean Springs. When we meet Mississippi 57, we're now signed east for Gaucher. In Gaucher, we're now signed east for Pascagoula, which you could argue should be signed from Ocean Springs, but I think signing Gaucher first is fine. When we meet Mississippi 63 and 611, we're now signed east for Mobile, which is fine. At the interchange with Franklin Creek Road, which just met I-10, we're now signed east for Grand Bay, which is the correct choice here. Well, that was short. Anyways, guys, Sweet Home Alabama time. In Grand Bay, we're now signed east for Mobile and Dauphin Island. Honestly, there's really no perfect control city here, but the best thing here you could sign is Theodore. When we meet I-10 again, we're now signed east for Tillman's Corner. When we meet Alabama 193, we're now signed east for Mobile, which is fine, but not fine. I mean, we're already in Mobile, I guess, but like, this is like the best thing to sign. This is really confusing, but I'm fine with it. When we meet I-65 north for Montgomery, we're now signed east for Government Boulevard, which is actually a lot better. US 90 does some extremely weird routing in Mobile, but anyways, we're now about to run concurrent with I-165 signed for 2 US 43. When US 90 leaves I-165, we're now signed east for Africantown Boulevard and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. According to Google Maps, US 43 begins here, but this sign clearly says 2 US 43, so I really don't don't know. Here we meet US 98 and are now concurrent with it. We also ran concurrent with it earlier, I just didn't show it, and we're now signed for 2 I-10. When we meet I-10 for a gajillion of times, signed east for Pensacola, we're now signed east for the Battleship Parkway. While crossing over the Mobile Bay, we meet I-10 again, signed for legit the exact same things. Here I-10 meets US 90 again, signed for nothing, and we also leave US 98 here as well. In Robertsdale, we're now signed east for Pensacola. Here we meet the Baldwin Beach Express, also Baldwin County Road 83, and you turn left here to get the Pensacola fastest from Robertsdale. We're now crossing over the Perdido River into Florida. I like this one the most out of all the state welcome signs in this video. When we meet I-110, we're now signed east for Cervantes Street, which is fine. When we meet I-10, we're now signed east for Pace, which is also the correct choice. After passing through Pace, we meet Florida 281, and we're now signed east for Milton. On the mileage sign, Tallahassee is on the bottom line in 183 miles, and Milton is a secondary in 2, which I'm actually fine with this because it's showing a larger destination that US 90 goes to, and also only do this on the mileage signs. When we meet Florida 87, we're now signed east for Holt. When we meet Florida 4, we're now signed east for Crestview. In Crestview, we meet Florida 85 and are now signed east for Mossy Head. When we meet Florida 285, we're still signed east for Mossy Head along with the Funiac Springs. When we meet US 331, we're now concurrent with it signed for the Funiac Springs because we're not in downtown yet. When US 331 leaves us, we're now signed east for Ponce de Leon. When we meet Florida 81, we're now signed east for Westville, which is the best thing you can sign here. I couldn't find anything in Westville, but anyways, in Bonifay, we meet Florida 79 and are now signed east for Chipley. In Chipley, we meet Florida 77 and are now signed east for Cottondale. When we meet US 231 in Cottondale, we're now signed east for Mariana. In Mariana, we meet Florida 166 and we're now signed east for Grand Ridge. Just sign Chattahoochee here, it's larger than Grand Ridge, and also US 90 is the fastest way to Chattahoochee from here. When we meet Florida 69, we're now signed east for Sneads. I mean, I guess it's better, but still, just sign Chattahoochee here. I couldn't find anything in Sneads, but in Chattahoochee, we get a mileage sign with Gretna as our secondary in 13 miles and Tallahassee as our primary in 41. In Quincy, we meet Florida 267 and we're now signed east for Tallahassee, which is actually faster to turn around and go back down to I-10 here, but Tallahassee is the only thing that can be signed on US 90 here. When we meet I-10 again, we're still signed east for Tallahassee. When we meet US 27 in Tallahassee, we're now signed east for Monticello. This interchange was requested by Dirtbog because of his video on US 27. When we meet I-10 on the other side of the city, we're still signed east for Monticello. On the mileage sign, Monticello is now our secondary in 18 miles and Jacksonville is our primary in 155. I'm fine with this for the same reasons as the one earlier of Tallahassee on the bottom line. In Monticello, we meet US 19 signed north for Thomasville and we're now signed east for Greenville. In Greenville, we meet US 221 and are now signed for Madison and Perry. Madison is for US 90 and Perry is for US 221. When US 221 leaves us, we're still signed east for Madison. In Madison, we meet Florida 145 and are now signed east for Live Oak. Going down to I-10 is actually the fastest way to Live Oak from here, so the best thing to sign here is Lee. I couldn't find anything in Lee, but anyways, when we meet I-10, we're still signed east for Live Oak. In Live Oak, we meet US 129 and we're now signed east for Lake City, but it's actually faster to go up to I-10 to get to Lake City from here, so I'd sign Wellborn first instead. I couldn't find anything in Wellborn, but anyways, when we meet I-75, we're still signed east for Lake City. In Lake City, we meet US 41 and we're now signed east for McClenny. Taking I-10 is actually the fastest way to get to McClenny from here, but it's the only thing to sign because Sanderson is unincorporated, but still US 90 is slower by like a minute, so it's not even that bad. When we meet I-10, we're now signed east for Sanderson. Just continue signing McClenny. There's no point to sign Sanderson. It's right here. I couldn't find anything in Sanderson, but anyways, in McClenny, we meet Florida 121 and we're now signed east for Baldwin. In Baldwin, we meet US 301 and we're now signed east for Jacksonville, which US 90 isn't the fastest way to downtown Jacksonville, but we're about to enter the city limits for Jacksonville. We kind of meet I-10 again. The interchange is a little bit weird, but anyways, we're now signed for Beaver Street, which is fine. Here we go under I-295 without having an interchange with it. When we meet I-95, we're still signed as Beaver Street. We actually meet I-95 again and we're now concurrent with it for Jacksonville Beaches and Daytona Beach. Jacksonville Beaches is for US 90 and Daytona Beach is for I-95 and US 1. Also, US 90 isn't the fastest way to Jacksonville Beach or any of the other ones, so don't sign anything for US 90 yet. When US 90 leaves I-95 and US 1, we're still signed east for Jacksonville Beaches along with Atlantic Boulevard. Once again, don't sign Jacksonville Beaches yet. This time we actually meet I-295 and we're now signed for Beach Boulevard. Now is when you should sign Jacksonville Beaches. Why isn't it signed here? At US 90's eastern terminus, we meet Florida A1A and it has no control cities. The control cities for US 90 should be Marfa, then Alpine, then Del Rio, skip Marathon, Sanderson, Dryden, and Langtry, then San Antonio, skip Brackenville, Uvalde, and Hondo, then Houston, then Liberty when you leave I-10, then Beaumont when you get to Dane, then Baton Rouge when you're concurrent with I-10 again, don't sign Lake Charles, then Vinton when you leave I-10, then Sulphur, Lake Charles, Iowa when you get out of Lake Charles, then Welsh, Jennings, then Crowley, Skidmore, Mental, then Rain, Dewson, Scott, Lafayette, New Iberia, Morgan City, Houma, when and if this part of US 90 ever becomes I-49, sign Houma first instead, then New Orleans, Claiborne Avenue in New Orleans, and Chef Mentor Highway when you meet I-10 again after Claiborne Avenue, then Pearlington when you meet US 11, then Gulfport, skip Bay St. Louis, then Biloxi, Ocean Springs, Gaucher, Pascagoula, Mobile, then Grand Bay when you meet Franklin Creek Road, then Theodore, Tillman's Corner, Government Boulevard, Montgomery when you're concurrent with I-165, then Africa Town Boulevard and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, and Battleship Parkway, then Nothing when you meet I-10, then Pensacola in Robertsdale, then Elsinore when you meet the Baldwin Beach Express, then Pensacola again, then Cervantes Street in Pensacola, then Pace, Milton, Holt, Crestview, Mossy Head, Defuniac Springs, Ponte de Leon, Westville, Bonifay, Chipley, Cottondale, Mariana, then Chattahoochee, skip Grand Ridge and Sneeds, then Quincy, then Midway, don't sign Tallahassee, then Tallahassee, then Monticello, Greenville, Madison, Lee, don't sign Live Oak yet, then Live Oak, then Wellborn, don't sign Lake City yet, then Lake City, McClenny, don't switch to Sanderson, Baldwin, Jacksonville, Beaver Shoe when you get in Jacksonville, Daytona Beach when you're concurrent with I-95 and US 1, don't sign Jacksonville Beaches yet, then Atlantic Boulevard when you leave I-95 and US 1, and then finally Jacksonville Beaches when you meet I-295, don't sign Beach Boulevard. If you enjoyed today's video, please subscribe. I also have more videos on my channel where I cover more US highways and also cover interstates and state highways, and I also look into and review control cities. Anyways, see you guys next time. Bye!